Hi everybody, it's Seymour Mehmedov. Welcome to my program In Search of Truth, and we are going to discuss the current situation in Afghanistan. So my questions today will be answered by National Tea Party co-founder, former White House speechwriter for President George Bush, Michael Jones. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Jones.
Great pleasure. Good to be with you.
Mr. Jones, once the Americans left Afghanistan, the Taliban quickly took control of an entire country. There is an opinion that the United States helped the Taliban to seize power in Afghanistan. What do you make of that? If this is not the case, what external actors helped the Taliban to come to power?
Well, I think it's all the above. Number one, you cannot help but look at the series of U.S. policy decisions dating back to the abandonment of the primary air base in Afghanistan that we built, where we left overnight, no advance notice, leaving extraordinary amounts of equipment, ultimately allowing this air base to be taken over by the Taliban, allowing the release of thousands of the most dangerous prisoners that were being housed in a prison site next to that air base, and then the consecutive steps that were taken that were consensus decisions by this administration, right? Historically on major issues of this nature, you'll hear internal differences and debate. Now, the Pentagon, the State Department, the NSC, Biden, the entire executive branch, all on the same page. In fact, boasting of the way they've handled this. And we have had Marines killed. We still have Americans in danger. We have 20-year longest war in American history that cost us $5 to $7 trillion and 2,400 KIAs plus 2,000 contractors. And we are essentially right back to where we were in on September 10th, 2001, with the exception that between 2001 and now, we have a Communist Party of China that's become extraordinarily more aggressive with this Belt and Road Initiative. And Pakistan has longstanding ties, as you well know, to the Taliban. I'm not sure there would be a Taliban without Pakistan, in fact. And that was an issue that we have encountered all the way back to the so-called Arab Mujahideen during the Soviet occupation. So I understand that it's very difficult to grasp. I personally have a difficult time grasping it, but there's only two answers to the question of how did this happen. One is that you have people with whom I would say I disagree ideologically, but I don't deny their competency. They're well educated, they're well experienced, they understand Afghanistan, and they've managed these functions before, in highly successful ways. They have the most powerful military in the world, far and away in the history of the world, at their disposal. And we're not talking about one policy error, two policy errors, a consecutive series of decisions, all that if you evaluated them in isolation, you would say undermined the elected government of Afghanistan, undermined the people of Afghanistan, empowered the Taliban, and which I would say is a terrorist movement. They've been engaged in war crimes. They should be the recipient of condemnations, not legitimacy. And ultimately really sent, I think, the world one of the worst examples of American national security and foreign policy management in 50 years. or all these so that's theory one, which I kind of am, I'm on board with that. Or theory two, if that becomes too difficult to digest, what you're then asked to digest is even more difficult, and that is that these people who are immensely competent made consecutive series of major errors that undermined this extraordinary, I think you call it an investment, $5 to $7 trillion in the future of Afghanistan and our relationship with them and the national security concerns in Central Asia. And after making one big mistake, then they made another big mistake. Not one person, not Biden, an entire team, as I can tell you, working in the White House. These decisions are not made in isolation. They're very deliberative, they're calculating, and they're pre-planned. And this, so my conclusion is that for what I would call a factor X, for which I only have theories, these policy decisions were not driven but predominantly or even a little bit by a concern for U.S. interests in Afghanistan, for Americans in Afghanistan, or for Afghans and Afghanistan itself. There was another consideration that drove these decisions. And then you ask, well, were foreign powers helpful to the Taliban's ascent? Yeah, of course. Number one, no doubt about it, Pakistan, even though they have told the world they cut off ties with the Taliban after 9/11, really never did. I am under no illusions that they were harboring bin Laden. Bin Laden was a mile from the equivalent of their West Point, a major military facility, their major military facility in Pakistan. They knew where he was. They were housing him. They were harboring him. They were protecting him. And it's a very unsettling reality because while Al-Qaeda was an enemy, while the Taliban, I believe, are an enemy, we don't view Pakistan as an enemy. And yet, when you've got a major regional power that is assisting, covering for, and enabling terrorist movements, you get a major crisis in the bilateral relationship. So we have issues there. And then, of course, the final coup de grace on, I'm not going to call it mismanagement because I think this was executed according to plan. How do you allow literally the collapse of this government that we've invested so much in, not just us, but also the coalition, NATO partners, and have all of these regional powers that have a distinct stake in Afghanistan? So let's take major powers of the world. No call made to Vladimir Putin by Joe Biden. No call made to Xi Jinping. No call made to the Pakistanis. No call made to our friends in Saudi Arabia. No call made to the ousted president of Afghanistan. No call made to the interim president of Afghanistan, who was serving as the first vice president. No call to the Taliban. I mean, no communication with the rest of the world. Very unprecedented, really. I mean, I could not cite, a time that's ever occurred with the development of that magnitude.
Michael, the Americans left behind many pieces of military equipment. But before leaving Afghanistan, the American military disabled a certain part of the military equipment. Now the Taliban have got the American weapons. I wonder if this was done on purpose. Why was it impossible to take out all the equipment from Afghanistan and then leave Afghanistan?
But we moved equipment in and out of Afghanistan for 20 years. We moved equipment in and out of Iraq for almost 20 years. It's not like we don't have deliberative, calculated policies on this. And actually, it's very disturbing that you have major media in the United States, especially at least, presenting it like it was some sort of oversight. You don't have oversights of that magnitude. Someone managing a corner store would know to clean out the inventory before you shut the store for good. This is the most powerful military in the history of the world, with extraordinary resources at its disposal, logistically, operationally, strategically. It was a conscious decision to leave that equipment there. That equipment has not been fully rendered dysfunctional. It's usable. It's $85 billion worth of equipment, and it's across a broad range of military functional capabilities that makes the Taliban more militarily strong than they were before seizing Kabul.
Mm-hmm. Michael, what challenges will the Central Asian countries face after the Taliban comes to power? Is there a risk of their invasion of this region in the future?
Well, I mean, I think we run a substantial risk. You want me to ballpark it? I'd say it's 50-50 that Afghanistan turns into potentially a terrorist superstate, the likes of which we haven't even witnessed in our lifetime, dwarfing the efforts they were engaged in the planning of the 9/11 attacks and harboring Al-Qaeda, which justified it's important to point out our involvement there. No one wanted the United States of America. It's important to point out, and especially to, I think, for the people not in the United States, has no desire to be occupying foreign nations, no appetite for it. And before World War II and our necessity of engagement in that, no real history of it. We were reluctant participants in this, and our measures were defensive. They were extensive. They were a lot longer than I think everyone envisioned. And there was some mission creep along the way because of the complexities of the underdevelopment of Afghanistan, politically, economically, and how that scenario was empowering the enemy. So that was a situation we probably haven't confronted, but we did confront it in Vietnam. It was a factor there. And that's the way it was, essentially managed. And I believe that President Trump did a good job, essentially, with negotiating an agreement with the Taliban that was, let's be very clear on this, conditional, right? They take a step, we take a step. They take a step, we take a step. That's not the way Biden approached it. Biden announces to the world the date that we're leaving, then moves that up, has no incremental drawdown, departs in the middle of the night out of the air base, and then ultimately leaving literally civilians and American military in harm's way, and doesn't communicate with the powers of the world. Well, the only reason you would really hypothetically do that would be that the real explanation for what motivated these, and let's be clear, a consecutive series of decisions, not one decision, not two decisions. We're talking about, like, you add them up, about roughly a dozen major decisions that empowered the Taliban, undermined the Afghan government, undermined Americans, and undermined the Afghan people. And as an American, I'm not happy to say that. I don't believe I've ever had to say that about my government in over 30 years of engagement in American politics and government. But we have to, if we're not clear at this moment about the underlying realities of what's transpired here, and let me be clear, I'm not hearing that out of Washington, D.C. I'm not even hearing that out of institutions, experts, and political leaders that are Republicans or conservatives and are opposed to Biden. There seems to be an unwillingness to deal with the world the way it really is. And that is an extremely dangerous mindset in any function in life, but particularly in national security and foreign policy. There's no room for it. You have to deal with the world the way it really is. It's always been a dangerous place, but we've never had this precedent where you really have to seriously operate on some sort of assumption that there's a factor X involved here that we have not been told. And that's why these Biden press conferences sound so rambling, because you could take, even a professional presidential speechwriter like me and put together the argument. If there's not some underlying credibility to the argument, even the most flowing rhetoric, even the most, persuasive presentation doesn't answer the questions that we're trying to answer of why, what would motivate these seemingly self-destructive policy steps. So we have to get our arms around that. And I'm not seeing, as usual, in the last 15, 20 years, Washington, D.C. is unwilling, unable, incapable of getting their arms around the really big issues. And there's been no creative thinking, even critical of the Biden agenda, that I'm seeing coming out of Washington, D.C. on Afghanistan. I, however, do have a policy that I think we ought to embrace, and hopefully I'll be able to chance to mention that to you.
Michael, my last question. I would like to know your opinion on our region, the South Caucasus. As you know, the Second Karabakh War ended with the victory of Azerbaijan. And today, Russian peacekeepers are in Karabakh. What is the attitude towards this issue in the USA? What policy will the United States pursue with regard to the South Caucasus? Or will the passive role of Americans in our region continue? What do you think about that?
Well, there's no room for regional expansion, or even if there's legitimate territorial gripes, as there are widely throughout the world, you don't address that with the use of force. And yet, like Crimea, we have an element of that still manifesting in post-Cold War Russia. And so, having played a big role in helping lead the Reagan Doctrine, which I think a good number of scholars have credited with the demise of and breakup of the Soviet Union, the reality is that they haven't developed the sort of relationship that I think most of us had envisioned and hoped for. And this is an example of it. So I'm very concerned about it. There's no room for it. It has to be on the issue of agendas that we raise. But ultimately, it's got to be more than rhetoric. Like, we need, real tangible and strong policies that are going to incentivize appropriate behavior. And especially when you're dealing with a country and that really doesn't have the capacity, resources to defend themselves against what is still kind of a global power in a lot of ways, even though they're, the economy is roughly the size of Italy's. It's not what it used to be, that's for sure. But it's a very legitimate concern. It doesn't get enough attention in the United States, and the future cannot be guided by that kind of behavior. And once you allow, this is what's dangerous, is once you allow the precedent to get established, and it's being established here in Afghanistan, the most prominent 21st century example, that if you can muster the force of will and get enough people willing to die for an act of aggression, we will reward you with legitimacy, with diplomatic recognition, with financial aid, with money, with credibility, with resources. With praise even. That's what's being heaped on the Taliban by the world now. It's disgraceful. Most of the leaders of the Taliban should be in The Hague facing charges of war crimes. And the legitimate government of Afghanistan is clearly specified in that constitution. Kudos to the people of Afghanistan in developing Constitution I took the liberty of reading that's very well developed, and it very clearly specifies how a situation like this is to be handled. And that is that First Vice President Saleh, now up in the Panjshir Valley, should be recognized as the interim president, and he in turn needs to recognize, as I believe he has, that the Constitution also calls for elections. So he's not president; he's an interim president. But the Taliban are not the government, and the U.S. should be leading on this, but other countries have an opportunity now to step up and lead too. Respect the constitutional rule of law that the people of Afghanistan developed, not the ruthless, barbaric violence that has the Taliban sitting in some government buildings in Kabul. They have no mandate to legitimacy. And it's absurd that we have leading leadership throughout the world that can't get their head around that fact.
Mm. Michael, thank you so much for your interesting answers.
Thanks for having me.